searches. Where I want to start our discussion today is with a really great secondary source on Westlaw, and it's called NIMR, N-I-M-M-E-R. And you'll notice what I'm doing. First, I'm typing in NIMR over here, and then I'm clicking on it as a content page over here. This is a great way to start your research. You can always ask a librarian or another information professional, what is a great secondary source? We know a lot of them, and so we can suggest a lot of them to you. I happen to really like this one called NIMR. And notice what I'm doing when I click on it. I'm going straight into that source. If I had to hit enter, then I would run a search for the word NIMR, and that would be a lot less useful. As we are looking at these chapters in NIMR, we could, of course, browse it like a book. Maybe probably don't want too much about the historical background of the First Amendment. Maybe we might have questions about government as educator. Those look like some interesting different things. You'll see discussion of Tinker and Fraser and Morse and disciplining students for school-related off-campus internet postings. I wonder if that could be useful. So that is one way of getting to useful stuff, is finding a really great source like NIMR and browsing this list of the table of contents like it was the table of contents of a book. Another possible way of doing it is by running a plain language search. And notice what it says up here, search SMOLA and NIMR on freedom of speech. That means that we are searching just this specific source rather than trying to drink from a fire hose of a whole bunch of stuff. Right underneath it, you're going to see a list of breadcrumbs. So notice here, home, secondary sources, texts, and treatises. There's actually a lot of different books on this shelf of constitutional law. And I will show you what those are and how we can pull those up. I mean, you could do it too if you clicked on it, but I don't encourage you to do that just yet. Instead, I'm just going to run a search up here for social media school. Not a sophisticated search by any means, but hitting that orange search button or hitting enter gives you the relevant section in NIMR, I hope. Here it is, number 3, because my search isn't fantastic. You may have to give the eyeball test to a couple things first. Disciplining students for school-related off-campus internet postings. You click on it, you open it up by way of quick review. If something is useful, you're doing research, but you will be synthesizing it, you'll be looking at this later, that's cool. Notice that folder button where it says folder selected. I'll show it to you here along that right-hand side, that folder button right next to download, email, and print. Clicking on that will open up that folder menu so that you can create a new folder, see that right there, call it school speech, and then once you've done that, you can click on it and hit save to start saving things there. So notice what we've got here. A secondary source explains to you the plain language of the law and links you to relevant cases like Donninger, like Bell, which I noticed was in your fact pattern, while summarizing what is going on in there, and then also explaining some of the rationale behind it. You'll notice as well that Bell cites Tinker, as well as some of these other Supreme Court precedents that deal with school speech. So Bell is really interesting because it has a lot of discussion in this section, and the rationale of Bell may be important to your case since it underpins a lot of the different citations to the district court's opinion that is currently up on appeal. Notice as well that in this section, there are also discussions of Tinker, Hazelwood, Bethel, and Morse, which are kind of your main exceptions to Tinker. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe we're not even sure what Tinker even is. And at this point, I would like to highlight this table of contents along the left-hand side, because notice what we've done. Right now, we are in a section of NIMR that talks about government as educator. And right now, you can start it off with some of these sections. You can also talk a little bit about non-disruptive symbolic speech, disruptive or vulgar speech, school-sanctioned events. And you can see here that maybe it might be helpful to start at the beginning, to kind of start with Tinker, to start with this idea of a lot of First Amendment rights of public school children, and then figure out what the exceptions are to this big kahuna of a Supreme Court precedent. What was Tinker about? Well, this will tell you, right? And it will also link you in the footnotes to where those things are in the opinion itself. I think that's also really useful. As we scroll through here, other discussions of kind of the follow-ups to Tinker and whether there is disruption. Whether there's disruption. And when there is disruption, then what happens? There was a case called Bethel, School District versus Fraser. Fraser had to do with this campaign speech, and it was full of things that were disruptive, lewd, and obscene. And that's quite interesting because as you look through here, maybe there's things in the fact pattern that might characterize it as that. And as you look through each of these sections, that might help you get kind of a better context of what the law is. So again, we started off with a source called Nimmer. We saw that there's a section that deals with disciplining students for off-campus internet postings. We added it to a folder called School Speech, and we saw that Bell is only one of many different cases that talk about off-campus postings on social media, even postings that are not super nice about school administrators, which is also factually on point with your case. And as you can see, also applying the standard in Tinker, Hazelwood, Fraser, and Morse. So that is one possible way to start your research with a secondary source and get to those cases. Back to the homepage by clicking on the Westlaw Edge logo, I'll talk about the second possible way of approaching things, which is, of course, to start with another secondary source, kind of that bigger landing page, constitutional. So you see where it says constitutional law texts and treatises, and I typed that out and I clicked on it. You'll see, again, as I said, there are a whole bunch of things on the shelf, not just Nimmer, specifically almost 70 secondary sources that, again, you could browse, or you could run that general thing, that general language search across that bookshelf and say, social media public school. And then we'll just see what we see in there. Of course, I think Nimmer would probably show up very close to the top, but there may be other things too from sources that you haven't even heard of that might be kind of interesting. So as we're looking and giving the eyeball to some of these things, maybe the discussion of social media public school might even be too broad of a search. As I'm looking through here, there's a lot of kind of tort stuff, defamation. There's some sort of pretrial type things or misuse. So maybe we need to add the word maybe First Amendment, social media, public school. Very interesting. But then keeping in mind that maybe we might even add more words like student so that we don't get stuff about teachers. As we're looking through these things, hopefully we'll see, yep, that section of Nimmer showing up here. So we would need to give the eyeball to a number of results here or come up with a better search. You'll see right on top of Nimmer is something about, student expression generally. And this treatise should hopefully also run down some of the things that we would need to know. There's an entire chapter about the right to free speech and expression in school. There's a section about off-campus expression. Student publications like underground newspapers. Of course, that doesn't seem like something that's terribly 21st century, but maybe we could argue by analogy. Maybe some of the things that were compelling here, the rationale holds to something like Facebook, because maybe that's more of an underground newspaper. Again, the idea is that we're starting with a secondary source. It runs down the list of some things for us to look at. and then it goes through it over here. I do have interest from somebody who may be joining in a second, so thank you very much for sending that out. It looks like there's 2 viewers right now, so I am super glad that there are folks on here on this training today. What I'm gonna do is run down that research process one more time. We started on Westlaw with a source called NIMR, and we got to NIMR by typing it out and clicking on it in the content page. I really like this one. By the way, if you've got questions, please send me an email or use the group chat along the right-hand side. If there's only a couple of viewers, great opportunity for you to send in your questions through the group chat or email samuel.burbano@tr.com. But if you're at NIMR, again, there is a plain language search that we could do to pull stuff up, or you could also browse this list here. Specifically, I like government as educator, and I really like disciplining students for school-related off-campus internet postings. That is a mouthful, so of course we could also search for it. Again, social media First Amendment or social media high school student or something like that would turn up some good stuff. Noticing as well here that NIMR is something that I might suggest to somebody who asked about it. In that first couple of results, disciplining students for off-campus internet postings. You may need to give the eyeball to some things because your search isn't incredibly great. Like maybe I should have added the word students on there or off-campus to be better reflective of the ideas that I'm looking for. But pulling up that section gives us a roadmap for thinking about the arguments in the case. And that's where you're at right now, which is brainstorming arguments, right? And finding things. And you can see that the arguments in Donninger, in Bell, and in the other cases that are cited here in the footnotes, there are lots, might help us get some sense of what the major discussions would be. Yeah, kind of interesting. Because also while we're here, that left-hand panel, government as educator, an entire chapter that sets forth, hey, here's Tinker, the high watermark of school speech for students. Disruptive or vulgar speech. Morse versus Frederick in the Bong Hits for Jesus case. All of these precedents come up in your fact pattern already, but if you didn't know what those cases said, or if you didn't find those cases to begin with, you can see that a secondary source not only gives you a roadmap to a specific issue, but also tells you what the related issues are, specifically kind of the grand poobah of them all here, Tinker, and then the progeny of Tinker, right? The cases that interpret it, like what? Well, that is very interesting, right? And you can see here that we'll tell you what those cases are, we'll tell you how they applied Tinker, and we'll also tell you what magic language they used to reach those conclusions. So once again, the name of that source, NIMR, can be reached from that drop-down. Oh, and before you go, right, make sure you have foldered that option by hitting the folder button. This class is being recorded, so I'm thinking about just starting at where I just began when I saw that there were 2 viewers on here. Thank you very much for joining me today. And what we will do from here is also show you that NIMR is part of a whole shelf of books, right? A whole bookshelf worth of things on here. Constitutional law texts and treatises, which once you click on it, shows you that you can search the entire, and see the entire link out here, and that there are over 60 secondary sources that talk about this. And you could use, again, First Amendment rights of students, social media posting. And now, instead of just searching one source, instead of just searching NIMR, you can search a ton of them all together without actually having to page through it or anything like that. Of course, my search, not super great, 10,000 results, oh my goodness, and a lot of things that might not be totally on point. Which is why, again, I highly suggest starting with specific sources so that way you don't have to drink from the fire hose. So what are those specific sources? How can I help you get a head start because if you're watching this or attending Westlaw training, I want to make sure you get something useful out of it. I suggested one called NIMR. I'm going to suggest another one for you called student discipline. There is actually something called Student Discipline Law Bulletin. Why? Because these lawyers that work for these school districts probably need to know about how all of these different social media posting principle, somebody's saying something nasty on here. Guess what? That's probably not the first time that's happened. And because this periodical, this school student discipline law bulletin comes in here, you see this stuff coming out again and again. A middle school student, we've got racist photo on social media. It looks like there's some sort of swastika. Again, if you use the word principal or find other words to throw in there, you might even find a recent analysis of a case that talks a little bit about derogatory words discussed at, discussing a principal or discussing a teacher or discussing a PE class, or maybe using a particular tool like Instagram or what have you. So I think that that is also a possible place, because each of these cases, even though they might not be district court cases, they're definitely not Supreme Court cases, but each of these cases at the lower levels may be really on point with your facts. So Student Discipline Law Bulletin, it's got a lot of discussion, including one about a fake internet profile of principal. Yeah, very interesting what happens if you run that search and see what shows up. Yeah, rolling through right now, so you can see that that is up here. What else would you see if you start your research with primary law? So I'm looking at something called this JS case, a student's free speech rights violated by her suspension for fake internet account of principal. If you start with a case like JS, because you can see here, this is a Third Circuit case. It's got a Westlaw site. It's from 2011. If you start with a case, if somebody gives you a case and says, hey, begin here, what I think is really interesting is that when you see these citing references, there's over 300 that talk about this case. So if you wanted to give the eyeball test to a bunch of things, that might be another possible logical way of winding things out. But you've also got the option to see how this case was distinguished. Noticing here that these flags on Westlaw indicate negative treatment for a case. So this case was cited by another case that said, hey, this is a different case. Why? For this point of law, for these points of law. And not just in one part of the country, but other circuits at district level, and so on and so on. And I think that's pretty interesting, because then you can see, look, if they didn't think this was a big deal, then it would probably be distinguished by cases that were a big deal. And again, clicking on that flag would tell that to you. AN, again, another fantastic case to start your research with. And as you look through here, hey, there's 11 secondary sources discussing it. And I guarantee you one of them might be something that we started with. Quinlan, Student Discipline Law Bulletin. So it doesn't matter if you start with Quinlan. It doesn't matter if you end with it. But you can see how it connects you to case law. And as you can see here, this case has not been overruled. There's no red flag. But it also hasn't been distinguished. So there's no yellow flag that says, hey, we are choosing to apply it differently based on a different set of facts. Noticing as well, there may be a couple other different secondary sources to begin your research. So again, I highlighted NIMR. I highlighted the Student Discipline Law Bulletin. And I'm also going to suggest another one for you here called Legal Almanac, the First Amendment. The way we get to it again, back to the homepage. These are all under the Constitutional Law Text and Treatises one, but I'm suggesting 3 of them for you here so you can get your research right on the right path here. Legal Almanac, First Amendment. Well, let's see here. There we go. I'm going to give you a database abbreviation. Sometimes if you don't, you can spell it out and get to it. Other times there can be a little bit of lingo that you will need to type out that's kind of shorthand. This is the one I'm going to suggest for you, which is LAS-speech. This is the name of a source on Westlaw. For some reason, I couldn't get to it by typing in Legal Almanac series. But if you do type in LAS-speech, you'll see again that there is another First Amendment secondary source that you can click on. It's in that kind of umbrella of constitutional law texts and treatises. And again, it will tell us the same thing, but by showing it to you maybe 3 different sources 3 different times, you get some practice in pulling up these things so that you can do this as well. Chapter 7, Government as Educator, Public School Student Speech Law. Are you telling me that there is a section that talks about tinker and exceptions to tinker and student online speech? Why, yes, right? We might click on that one to go straight to it. Again, those plus buttons to pop out the discussion there. And as we go through there, again, it should just tell us the same kinds of things, but maybe it would cite different cases, like this whole Fenton and Klein, where they call the teacher a naughty name. But then Klein versus Smith distinguishes it. It reaches a different conclusion. But you can see here that these discussions of maybe derogatory treatment of fellow students or classmates have citations in the case law, including some that look like they have been abrogated. Very interesting. Maybe want to check that one out. But that these workflow tools should allow us, again, to folder these selected things so that we can pull them up and read them in greater detail. In as few words as possible, what have we done to start your research off as you were brainstorming? I think we've started with a good secondary source, whether that's the Legal Almanac, whether that's student discipline law building, whether that's NIMR. And it tells us what tinker says. It tells us the exceptions to tinker. And then it also tells us, hey, student online speech is kind of a different beast than any of these clearer lines of cases where there's like a totally on-point Supreme Court case, and you may have to synthesize the rule from a bunch of lower court precedents. When we pull those up, we pay special attention to making sure that those precedents have not been overruled. And by clicking on it and figuring out maybe what part of it is overruled with reference to the headnotes, that might help us build our argument as well. Plenty of other things I'd like to discuss with you on campus all day Friday. Drop me a line or email referenceattorneys@tr.com or use that live chat function down there. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of our chat today. I'm going to check the chat window here as well to see if anybody has any questions. I'm going to stick around here for 30 seconds or so, just in silence, waiting for folks to send things in. Hopefully there are still people watching. I see a couple of viewers here. While you're waiting for those questions to come in with bated breath, keeping in mind, if you do enough browsing on Westlaw, we will suggest some content for you. That research recommendations button is something, that gem that highlights after you've done enough related research, and you might have the option to say, hey, there are key numbers on disruptive student conduct. Very interesting. There's key numbers about education and control and discipline. Also very interesting, especially if you're part of Professor Preston's class and you need to supply those key numbers to give your research. Clicking on those will update your research with similar cases in your jurisdiction on that particular point of law. And we found them just by doing regular research. Isn't that exciting? Looking along the right-hand side, I see no questions from folks. This will be recorded and posted online. So if you have a chance, give this a gander later and let me know as you have questions. Thanks for watching and have a great day.